The coffee spread across white marble in one wide brown stain, and the laughing started before the last cup had stopped spinning. Sadie Kowalczyk was 27 years old, small, too thin for a woman who worked 14-hour shifts, with her brown hair pulled back and hands cracked open at the knuckles from years of bleach and scalding water. She'd been carrying that tray across the front courtyard of the Marchetti estate, the way she carried everything in her life, quietly, carefully, like a woman who'd learned a long time ago that being noticed had never once worked out in her favor. Then Camille Ashford stepped sideways into her path, and the elbow that caught the tray was so light, so casual, that half the people standing there would swear afterward it was an accident. Camille didn't shout. Women like Camille never shout. She just looked down at the faded gray uniform and said, quietly enough that everyone had to lean in, "That stone like this can't take a rag. She'd have to use her hands." And Sadie knelt. She didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't look up. She folded back the sleeve of her worn jacket and started wiping while the catering staff laughed behind her, and Camille's mother laughed loudest of all. Nobody in that courtyard noticed the black car turning up the drive. Sadie did. She'd heard it half a minute earlier, and she kept kneeling anyway. Elias Marchetti was 34. Tall, dark-haired, beard trimmed close, dressed in white the way he was always dressed in white. He ran the ports, the construction, half the coastline south of the city, and he'd never once in his life needed to raise his voice. The laughing died the way a room goes silent when the power cuts out. Bernadette Mullaney, known as Mrs. Bertie, the housekeeper, grabbed Sadie's arm and hissed at her to get up. "Get up right now. Don't let him see you like this." Sadie stayed down. And Elias crossed that courtyard without looking at his fiancée, without looking at a single guest, and walked straight to the woman kneeling in the spill. Then the most powerful man in that city lowered himself down until his eyes were level with hers. He took both her ruined hands and held them still. He asked her name. She told him it didn't matter. He asked again. 60 people stood on those steps, and not one of them dared to breathe. Because whatever was coming next, every single one of them understood the same thing in the same moment. Nothing in that house was ever going to be the same again. If a story about dignity moves you, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe so you never miss what we tell next. Now let's go back to that courtyard, to a kneeling woman and a man in a white suit, and find out what happened when he finally stood up. He straightened to his full height, and the white fabric at his side was ruined beyond saving. A dark brown stain sunk so deeply into the cloth that no cleaner could ever remove it, but he never once looked down at it. He turned toward the steps, where the people who had been laughing only moments before now stood rooted in place, and in the quiet voice that had always been the most frightening thing about him, he said that the morning reception was over. No one moved. He didn't repeat himself. He simply let his gaze pass over every face, one by one, slowly, like a man taking notes. And that look proved more effective than any shout, because everyone in this city understood that when Elias Marchetti looked at someone longer than necessary, that person ought to begin reconsidering everything they owned. The first to descend the steps was the owner of an investment bank, and after him, the entire courtyard dissolved like snow beneath the sun. Camille Ashford didn't leave. She remained where she was, her arms still folded across her chest, her face still wearing the composure her mother had spent Camille's entire childhood teaching her to maintain, and she told him that he had just done something deeply unbecoming in front of people who would remember it for a very long time. Elias said he knew. She asked whether he intended to explain himself. He said no. She waited one beat longer, only one, and then she understood that he truly wasn't going to say another word, and for the first time in all those seasons of their engagement, she felt the ground beneath her feet tilt ever so slightly. He told the driver to take her home. She left without looking back, and everyone in the house knew that a woman who didn't look back was a woman counting debts. Bernadette Mullaney pulled Sadie inside through the servant's side entrance, gripping her elbow as though afraid she might dissolve before they reached the kitchen, muttering without pause in the thick Irish accent that emerged only when she was genuinely frightened. Once inside the kitchen, she pushed Sadie down onto the wooden chair beside the sink and turned on the faucet. Sadie sat without moving. She stared at her hands lying open in her lap, at the split knuckles seeping something pale and cloudy. And what she thought about wasn't the pain or the humiliation, but one very simple, very cold question: why was she still inside this house? She had already worked everything out. She had been calculating from the moment the tray left her hands. In her mind, Everything unfolded in the same order her life always had. Someone would call the employment agency. The agency would enter one short line into her file, and that short line would follow her to every door she knocked on through many seasons to come. She had prepared herself for those words. She had never prepared herself for a man like that kneeling until his eyes were level with hers. The kitchen assistant brought over a towel and withdrew almost at once, and Sadie realized that everyone in the kitchen was avoiding her, not out of contempt, but out of fear. The kind of fear felt by people who had lived in a house long enough to understand that standing too close to something that had just been marked was never safe. Bernadette wrung out the towel, sat down in front of her, and rested Sadie's hand on her own lap. For a long while, she said nothing. She only looked at her with the eyes of a woman who had served in this house since the previous master was still alive, who had watched more young women than she could count pass through those gates, and who had learned to recognize within the first week who would endure and who wouldn't. Then she lowered her voice and told Sadie to listen to her just this once. "In this house," she said, "those he forgets can survive, and even those he hates can still find a way to live. But no one he sets his eyes on has ever known a peaceful life." She gently squeezed Sadie's half-bandaged hand and added that Sadie hadn't stood up that morning when she'd been told to, and Bernadette had seen clearly that she'd heard the car approaching before anyone else. So there was only one question she wanted to ask her. "Child, what did you come to this house to do?" Sadie didn't answer the question. She looked down at the basin of water slowly turning pale pink and said that she had come to work. "Ma'am," that she had always come to work. And Bernadette nodded slowly, in the manner of a woman who had just heard a lie, but had no intention of exposing it today. She lowered Sadie's hands into the water, and Sadie flinched once, then held still. Bernadette told her to leave them there. "Salt water stung when it seeped into a crack," she said, "but anything that could still sting could still heal." She cleaned each knuckle one at a time, as carefully as someone cleaning an old piece of pottery, then took a roll of bandages and a jar of ointment that was already more than half empty from a drawer. She said she had bandaged the hands of more girls than she could count in that kitchen, and she had watched most of them walk out through the gates before the rainy season had even passed. She said that if Sadie wanted to stay, she would have to learn 3 things, and she was only going to say them once, so she had better listen carefully. Keep your hands busy, because idle hands in this house would always inspire someone to find a task for them, and it had never once been a good one. Keep your mouth closed, because every word you spoke here would eventually reach someone's ears, and you would never get to choose whose ears they were. And keep your eyes half closed, because the most dangerous thing in this house wasn't knowing too little. It was knowing too much and letting people see that you knew. Sadie was silent for a long time, then said that she was afraid she had broken all 3 of those rules a very long time ago. "Ma'am." "Mrs." Bertie looked up, and Sadie began to tell her, not because she wanted to, but because the hand of an older woman holding hers caused something inside her chest to come undone, something she had kept clenched tight through so many seasons, without ever daring to loosen her grip. She told her that when she was still a child, she had carried a truth home one afternoon and placed it in her mother's hands. She said she remembered how carefully she had carried it, as though it were a fledgling with a broken wing, afraid it might shatter along the way. Her father had died in a construction accident before she was old enough to understand what had happened, and his meager death benefit was the only thing keeping the electricity on in their house. The man her mother had brought home to live with them had taken that money little by little, slowly enough that no one would call it stealing. But Sadie had counted. She had written it all down, and one afternoon in September, she had carried that little notebook to her mother and placed it in her hands. Sadie continued, her voice as flat as if she were reading from an old bill, and said that her mother had believed her. That was the part that hurt the most. Her mother had held the notebook, read every page, and believed every word. Then she had closed it, handed it back to Sadie, and told her never to mention the matter again. Sadie said she had stood there waiting for her mother to grow angry, waiting for her to cry, waiting for anything at all, but her mother had simply turned back to the sink and said that he was paying the household bills. Bernadette set down the jar of ointment. Sadie said that from that day on, she had understood an equation she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Believing her came at a price, and her family couldn't afford to pay it. She had thought about that for years, ma'am. She had thought that if she could do more, if she could make herself more useful, then perhaps her price would come down a little, and people would decide it was cheaper to keep her than to throw her away. She had lived her whole life according to that calculation, and it hadn't been right even once. Mrs. Birdie sat perfectly still. Then she took both of Sadie's bandaged hands in her own, raised them until they were level with her eyes, and told her to listen, child, because she would say this only once and would never speak of it again. The person who told you that you were too expensive wasn't placing a value on you. That person was placing a value on themselves. They were naming the price they were willing to pay, and that price was so small it ought to shame them. But the shame belonged to them, not to you. She released Sadie's hands, rose to her feet, and told her to wash her face, then return and finish the work in the upstairs kitchen, because precious things were kept safely inside a cabinet, not left out where flies could settle on them. Sadie washed her face with cold water in the servants' washroom, and when she raised her head and looked into the mirror, she remembered that she still had 3 hours left in her shift, that the library still needed cleaning, and that she had no right to think about anything beyond those 2 things, because every hour recorded on the staffing agency's timesheet was another line in the file she would place on the judge's desk at the end of that summer. Family court had made everything very clear to her, in the polite, cold language of people who had never been forced to sleep in a car. They needed to see stable housing. They needed to see a lawful and continuous source of income. They didn't need to know how deeply she loved her daughter, because love couldn't fill out a form. Ruthie was 4 years old, and she was staying with a distant aunt near Homestead, in a house with a backyard and a low fence, and Sadie was grateful to that woman in the most painful way one mother could ever be grateful to another person, grateful that someone could do what she herself couldn't. The little girl was waiting for heart surgery. The doctor had said that if everything went well, she would one day be able to run like any other child, that she would be able to climb the stairs without having to sit and rest on the 4th step. And Sadie kept those words in her mind the way someone might carry a glowing coal in a coat pocket through the winter. She was allowed to visit her daughter on Sunday afternoons. The last time, she had sat on the back steps and brushed Ruthie's hair, and when she was finished, the little girl had turned around, looked up at her mother, and asked a single question. When would Mommy stop being busy? Sadie had said something. She couldn't remember what it was. She only remembered that throughout the 3-hour bus ride back to the city, the question had repeated itself inside her head as steadily as the sound of the wheels passing over the joints in the road, and she had understood that the child wasn't blaming her at all. Ruthie was only asking for the time. She believed such a time existed. Sadie carried exactly 1 photograph in her wallet, taken with a disposable camera at some autumn fair, its edges worn white from being pulled out and put back so many times, and she kept it in the outermost compartment so she could touch it without having to open the wallet. That afternoon, she cleaned the library, and as she moved her cloth along the shelves, she realized something she had vaguely noticed during her first week, but had never named. There wasn't a single photograph anywhere in the house. Not one. There were no wedding pictures, no portraits of parents, no photographs of a child laughing on a beach, not even the empty frames people sometimes placed on a surface simply to fill the space. There were paintings, ceramic vases, leather-bound books no one had ever opened, and every object an interior designer might arrange to fill an empty wall. But there wasn't a single human face. Sadie stood in the middle of that room with the cleaning cloth still in her hand, and thought that a person might forget to buy a photograph. But no one forgot for that many years. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was something that had been done, and done with great care. She thought of a man who had passed through his own life erasing every trace he left behind, until the only thing that could still be read inside this house was the mark of the erasure itself. Then she bent down and continued cleaning, because she still had 2 hours left in her shift, because there was a photograph with worn edges inside her wallet, and because a child in Homestead was waiting for her mother to stop being busy. She had cleaned as far as the hallway connecting the library to the office when she heard the front door open, followed by the sound of 3 pairs of shoes crossing the stone floor. One pair moved with firm, measured steps, another moved very quickly, and the third dragged along as though those feet were trying to pull the rest of the body back toward the gate. Sadie knew she ought to leave. Mrs. Birdie had been very clear about keeping her eyes half closed, but she was kneeling in the middle of the hallway beside a bucket of water and a stretch of unfinished floor, and anyone who had ever done this kind of work understood that getting up and walking away before the job was finished looked far more suspicious than simply keeping one's head down and continuing to clean. So she continued. The office door closed but didn't latch, and the voices carried clearly into the hallway, one of those peculiar features of large houses that their owners rarely considered. She recognized Rocco Vitale's voice first, the booming voice of a man who always spoke louder than necessary, because somewhere deep inside, He wasn't certain anyone was listening. He said that he had brought the man as instructed, sir, that the books for Pier 7 showed a discrepancy, and that the numbers had been wrong since spring. Then came the scrape of a chair, followed by the third man's voice. He began speaking very quickly, one sentence tumbling over the next, about an advance, about a supplier who had turned against him, about how he had intended to explain everything for a long time, but had never found the right moment. Elias allowed him to finish. Sadie slowed the movement of her cloth. She had been in enough rooms with angry men to know that a long silence was always more frightening than a shout, and she realized that she was holding her breath in the same rhythm as the man inside the office. When Elias finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that Sadie had to lean closer to the door. He didn't mention the money. He didn't ask how much, didn't ask when it had begun, and didn't ask who else was involved. He asked whether the man's daughter was well. The other man fell silent. Elias named a school on the south side of the city, one whose name everyone living there knew, then said that the girl's tuition for the next several school years had already been paid in full. It had been paid at the beginning of summer, before the man had ever set foot inside that room. He said the girl wouldn't be summoned to the office, wouldn't have to hear someone quietly mention the overdue payment in front of her friends, and would never know that a morning like this one had ever taken place. Then he spoke one final sentence, and Sadie would remember it for a very long time. He said that as of today, Mr. Delgado no longer owed him money. He owed him the child. And every morning when he drove her to those school gates, Elias expected him to remember who had opened those gates for her. There was a very faint sound, perhaps a breath, perhaps the sound of a man collapsing into a chair. Then the door opened. The man passed the place where Sadie knelt without seeing her. His face drained white, one hand pressed against the wall like someone who had just stepped off a pitching ship, and Sadie understood that he would leave this house with both legs intact, with his family intact, and with his job intact, yet he would never again be a free man. Rocco followed behind him, whistling softly. Sadie lowered her head over the bucket and cleaned the same place she had just cleaned, slowly and steadily, until the sound of their shoes had completely faded beyond the courtyard. She had believed she knew exactly what kind of man was dangerous. She had grown up beside such a man, and thought she could recognize every sign. But the man inside that room hadn't been angry, hadn't raised his voice, and hadn't needed anything heavier than a question about a child's health. And for the first time since that morning, Sadie was afraid. Near the end of her shift, Gideon Pratt came down to the kitchen and said that the master wanted to see her in his office, and the entire kitchen fell silent in the way people did when they heard the name of a disease. Mrs. Birdie opened her mouth as though she meant to say something, then thought better of it. Sadie removed her gloves, washed her hands, fixed her hair, and went upstairs. She had climbed staircases like this many times in her life, in many different houses, and she knew this feeling well, the feeling of someone about to enter a room where a decision about her had already been made before she ever knocked on the door. Elias was standing beside the window, and he had changed into another suit, still white. He told her to sit down. She sat with her back straight and both hands resting on her lap, so he wouldn't have to see the bandages. Then he said nothing at all. He waited. Sadie immediately understood what he was waiting for. She had seen that expectation on the faces of powerful men all her life. That moment when they sat down before someone beneath them and waited to hear the request, because everyone who entered a room like this carried a request with them. Please let me keep my job. Please give me an advance. Please don't report me to the staffing agency. Please remember me when another position becomes available. It was the finest part of their day, the part when they got to be the person who had something to give. Sadie said nothing. She sat still and looked at the empty stretch of desk before her, and the silence lasted long enough to become unusual, then longer still, until it became something else entirely. At last, Elias asked whether she had anything she wanted to say. She answered no, sir. He asked whether she intended to apologize for what had happened that morning. She said she hadn't dropped the tray, so she had nothing to apologize for, and if he wanted her to apologize for having been there, she could do that too. But both people in the room knew it wouldn't be a real apology. He asked if that meant she wasn't going to ask for her job, ask for money, or ask for anything at all. She said no. He said everyone asked. Sadie looked up and met his eyes for the first time since entering the room, and she said that she knew, sir. And she also knew why he waited for it. She said that if she sat there and cursed him, if she told him everything she thought about this house and the people who lived in it, he would listen to every word. He wouldn't interrupt her once, and when she was finished, he would feel like a strong man because he had stood firm against all of it. But if she knelt and begged him to let her stay, begged him to have mercy on her, then he would give her what she asked for, and afterward he would feel like a generous man. She said she meant no disrespect. She was only speaking a very simple truth, that both of those things would be things she did for him, not for herself, and she had nothing left. She had worked 14 hours that day, and she would work another 14 the next, and there was no room left inside her to carry the additional burden of helping a man feel better about himself. If he wanted to fire her, then he could fire her. She would go and get her coat, walk to the bus station, and never speak badly of this house anywhere, because she didn't have time for that. Elias didn't move. In all the years he had spent sitting on this side of a desk, no one had ever spoken to him that way. And it wasn't insolence that left him unable to breathe, because there hadn't been a trace of insolence in anything she said. What stole his breath was that she was right in every single word. And in less than one day she had seen through him to something an entire city hadn't recognized in more than a dozen seasons. He turned toward the window and told her to leave. She rose, nodded, and walked out, closing the door very softly behind her, exactly as a good servant always closed a door. Elias didn't sleep that night. He sat until dawn in the room without a single photograph, thinking over and over about how she had said she had nothing left, and about how, in his entire life, he had never once allowed himself to say those words aloud. The next morning, they gathered in the small dining room in the East Wing, the room the family had always reserved for conversations that were never entered on any calendar. Ambrose Marchetti arrived first, as he always did, and poured his own coffee instead of allowing anyone to do it for him, a habit left over from the days when he was still working his way up. He was Vittorio's younger brother, and he had occupied that advisor's chair since before anyone in the house had called Elias by the name Marchetti. Rocco Vitali arrived afterward, carrying a thick file and the eagerness of a man delivering bad news that he didn't consider bad at all. He said there was movement at the federal level. It wasn't the city police or the state tax department, but a federal audit team, and they had begun with the subcontractors at the port rather than with the ledgers, which meant someone had shown them where to start. Ambrose set down his coffee cup very gently. He asked how much time they had. Rocco said about a month, perhaps less, before the formal demand for their records arrived. Ambrose nodded and said that within that month, everything in this house had to become so clean that when the auditors looked into it, the only thing they saw would be their own faces reflected back at them. Then he turned to Elias and added that there was another matter, and this was one from which his nephew couldn't retreat: the wedding. He said the Ashford name didn't bring this family a single dollar, never had, and anyone who said otherwise was either a liar or a fool. That name brought them something else. It was a coat of paint. When a federal audit team opened a file and saw a family whose name had appeared on half the churches and hospitals in the county since the days of their forefathers, they would read more slowly, ask their questions more softly, and think more carefully before signing anything. He said Elias would marry the woman on schedule, stand for the photographs, smile, and let the entire city see those two names printed beside each other on an invitation. Elias said nothing. Rocco glanced at him very quickly, then lowered his gaze to the file, and for a moment, his face revealed something Ambrose noticed, and Elias didn't: the expression of a man committing a silence to memory so he could make use of it later. Rocco said that Elias had handled the matter with the Pier 7 contractor beautifully the previous morning, sir, but if it had been him, he would have made sure the man felt a little pain. Elias replied that when you made people feel pain, they forgot as soon as the pain ended. But when you gave them something to lose, they remembered for the rest of their lives. Rocco laughed, nodded, and said, "Of course, sir." He still had much to learn. But he didn't believe that, and all three men in the room knew it. Ambrose rose, tucked his coat beneath his arm, and before leaving, placed a hand on Elias's shoulder, a gesture he made only when he intended to speak from the heart. He said that he had sat at this table since Elias's father was still alive, and he had seen what happened to men who began wanting something beyond the work. He told Elias not to want anything now, wait until the month had passed. Then he left. Alone, Elias drew the file Rocco had left behind toward him. It contained a list of the subcontractors that had worked and were still working on projects bearing the corporation's name, arranged by contract code and accompanied by the recorded workplace accidents. He read slowly, one page at a time, doing the work he should have done many seasons ago but hadn't, because there had been a time when he had made an agreement with himself that those pages weren't his responsibility. Then he stopped midway through one of them. A line described the collapse of a warehouse floor in Hialeah. Beneath it, in the column listing the victim, was a name: Jonah Kowalczyk. Elias read the name 3 times. He remembered that last name clearly, because only the afternoon before yesterday, he had seen it written in blue ink on the staffing agency's timesheet, beside the name of a 27-year-old woman before whom he had knelt in the middle of his own courtyard. He sat for a very long time without turning to the next page. He summoned Gideon Pratt and placed the open file in the middle of the desk, already turned to the correct page, then asked what he knew about the warehouse floor collapse in Hialeah. Gideon looked down at the page, and the first thing Elias noticed was that he didn't bend closer to read it. He merely looked at the name, then raised his head. Elias asked again. Gideon said that he knew about the accident, sir. Elias asked whether he remembered the man's name. Gideon said yes. Then he stood there, with his arms hanging at his sides, and said that if Elias wished, he could recite them all without the papers. Elias told him to begin. And Gideon began. He started with a name from Opalaka, from the first summer after Elias acquired the transportation company, then moved to another name from Pier 3, then 2 brothers who had worked together at a riverside construction site, then a Guatemalan man whose family name no one in the records had spelled correctly, and then another, and another, steadily, without stumbling, without pausing to remember. In the flat voice of a man reciting a prayer rather than reading a list, he spoke for a very long time. Elias didn't interrupt him. When Gideon finally stopped, the room was so quiet that they could hear the air conditioner running inside the wall, and Elias asked how many people there were altogether. Gideon said nearly 40, sir. Elias asked why he had memorized them. Gideon was silent for a while, then said that at first he had written the names down, but he had burned the paper because keeping it was dangerous, and afterward he discovered that he could no longer forget them. He said he had always told himself that he counted, so he could never deceive himself into believing there had been fewer than there truly were. That was what he told his wife on the nights when she asked why he sat outside on the porch. But if Elias wanted the truth, then he would tell him the truth. The counting was the last part of him that remained awake. As long as he could still count them, he still knew what he was doing. The day he stopped counting would be the day he became something else. Elias told him to bring up the entire Hialeah file, without a single page missing. Gideon left and returned with a yellowed folder made of heavy paper. Elias opened it. There were structural drawings, an insurance company report, a cleaning and cargo handling contract signed with a company called Meridian, a personnel roster, and the second floor safety inspection report, stamped and signed by hand. The name beneath the signature was Ronald Pike. Elias read the date it had been signed. Then he turned the accident report over and read the date the floor had collapsed. He read both dates twice more to be certain. The inspection report certifying that the second floor could safely bear its required load had been signed after that floor had already collapsed. He pushed the 2 pages toward Gideon without saying a word. Gideon looked at them, and he didn't appear surprised, and that absence of surprise told Elias more than any confession could have. Gideon said this was how such things had always been done, sir. No one sat down to discuss it, and no one gave an order. It was simply the way people did things. If there was an accident, there had to be an inspection report, and the report had to predate the accident, so someone signed it and changed the date. This time, the man signing it had simply been careless. Elias asked who had paid Ronald Pike. Gideon said he didn't know who had paid him, but he knew where the money had passed through. And if Elias truly intended to pull on that thread, he had to understand that its other end was tied to the very house in which he was sitting. Elias closed the file and told him to leave. At the door, Gideon stopped and added something Elias hadn't asked. He said the man had left behind a wife, sir. Then he walked out. Camille returned to the mansion in the middle of the week, under the pretext of discussing the guest list, and by that afternoon, everyone in the house knew that Vittorio Marchetti's watch was no longer in the safe inside the library. It was the only thing Elias had kept from his father, an old watch with a tarnished gold face, inexpensive compared with everything else in that house, and anyone who had worked there long enough understood that its value had nothing to do with money. Camille was the one who reported it missing. She said she had opened the safe to put away a set of documents and discovered that the place where the watch belonged was empty. She spoke in the voice of someone who had been forced by duty to do something unpleasant. Gideon ordered the servants' rooms searched, and they found the watch inside Sadie's wardrobe, wrapped in a kitchen cloth and hidden beneath a folded raincoat in the bottom drawer. Everyone in the house gathered in the large kitchen, and no one spoke, and Sadie stood among them, with both hands still wrapped in bandages. She didn't protest her innocence. She looked at the watch lying on the wooden table and thought, with perfect calm, that this was where it ended, that she would lose the timesheet for the entire month, and that at the end of the summer she would have to explain it to someone wearing a suit behind a desk in family court. Mrs. Bertie took half a step forward, then stopped, because she was wise enough to know that speaking now would only cause them both to drown. Camille said that none of this was truly surprising, then added that she didn't want to call the police. It would be enough to get the woman out of the house before dark. Then Elias entered. He didn't look at Sadie. He didn't look at the watch. He asked Gideon whether the library safe kept an access log. Gideon said it did, sir, and that it recorded the time of every opening. Elias told him to print it. Then he asked whether there was a camera in the second-floor hallway. Gideon said there was. Elias told him to retrieve the footage from that morning until the present moment. While they waited, no one in the kitchen dared move, and Camille stood, with her arms still folded across her chest, her face wearing the same composure as before, but she had begun counting very quickly inside her head, and she couldn't find a single number that favored her. Gideon returned with the printed page. Elias read it, then read aloud so everyone in the kitchen could hear that the safe had been opened exactly once that day, in the middle of the morning. He asked Gideon where Miss Kowalczyk had been at that time. Gideon consulted the work schedule and said she had been cleaning the third floor, sir, in the west guest wing, and 2 other people on the same shift had seen her there. Elias told him to play the second-floor hallway footage from that exact time. No one needed to watch all of it. A few seconds were enough. Elias turned off the screen, faced Camille, and in that quiet voice, asked where she had been at that hour. Camille didn't answer. Everyone in the kitchen stood rooted to the floor, and in all their years of service, not one of them had ever witnessed a woman of the Ashford family questioned in such a way before the servants. Camille asked whether he truly intended to do this in front of them. Elias replied that she had chosen this place, not him. Then he said nothing more to her. He picked up the watch, slipped it into his coat pocket, and turned to look at every person standing in the kitchen, one by one, slowly, exactly as he had looked at the guests on the steps the other morning. He said he would say this once, and wouldn't repeat it. This woman worked in his house, received her wages from his house, and from that moment forward, she stood beneath his roof. If any of them believed she was an easy person to blame, then they needed to understand one thing clearly. Any hand raised against this woman was a hand raised against him. And he wasn't an old watch they could take away and hide beneath a raincoat. He said that whoever had wrapped that watch and carried it into her room had better pray that he never discovered their name. Then he ordered everyone out. They scattered quickly, and no one dared look at anyone else. Sadie remained where she was, and she understood that she had just been saved. Yet she felt no relief at all, because in her life, no gift had ever arrived without a price written on the back. Nearly everyone had left when Elias called one name back. The assistant butler stopped in the doorway, turned around, and tried to summon the smile of a man who had merely fulfilled his duty. Elias asked who had told him to enter Miss Kowalczyk's room. The man said that Mrs. Ashford had ordered the servants' rooms searched, sir, and he had only followed instructions. Elias asked whether she had told him which room to search first. The man hesitated. Elias said he wasn't asking to find fault with him. He was asking because he wanted to know whether the man had chosen that order himself or whether someone else had chosen it for him. The man couldn't answer. Elias nodded as though he had received all the answer he needed. Then, still speaking in that quiet voice, he told the man to gather his belongings and leave that afternoon. The assistant butler began talking about all his years of service, about his wife, and about the mortgage on his house, and Elias allowed him to finish, just as he always allowed everyone to finish. Then Elias said he wouldn't withhold the man's severance pay, wouldn't write a single word about the incident in his letter of reference, and wouldn't tell anyone what had happened. The man looked up, and for a moment, something close to gratitude appeared on his face. Elias continued. He said that 10 years from now, when the man carried his papers from door to door along this coast, from there northward to the last of the houses beside the bay, someone would make a telephone call. People always called, and they would call him. He said he would answer. He would speak very politely. He wouldn't say one unkind word about the man, and the man would never know what he had said. The assistant butler stood there for another moment, and then he understood. and Sadie saw the instant understanding reached him, because the color of his face changed from the inside out. He said nothing more. He turned away, one visibly trembling hand gripping the doorframe, and the sound of his footsteps fading along the hallway belonged to a man 20 years older than the one who had entered the kitchen. 2 people remained. Elias placed the watch on the wooden table and told Sadie to go to her room and rest. She had done enough for the day. Sadie didn't move. She looked down at the kitchen cloth still lying on the table, then said that with his permission, she wished to say one thing, "Sir," and when she was finished, she would return to work. He waited. She said that 10 minutes earlier, he had stood in the middle of that kitchen and protected her in front of everyone, and she knew what that meant to someone like her. She would never forget it. Then she said that 1 minute earlier, she had stood there and watched him erase a man's entire life with 2 sentences. He hadn't touched him. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply told the man that the telephone would ring, and that was the end of it. She said she wasn't judging him. She had no right to do that, and she didn't have the strength for it either. She only wanted him to understand where she stood. She stood directly between those 2 things, sir. The hand that had protected her and the hand that had just done that were the same hand, and she had lived long enough to understand that when someone was protected by a hand like that, they must never allow themselves to forget what it was capable of doing. Elias didn't answer. He looked at her for a long time, and Sadie waited for him to say something, waited for him to become angry, waited for him to explain, waited for him to tell her that she didn't understand business. He did none of those things. He merely picked up the watch, slipped it back into his coat pocket, and walked out of the kitchen. Sadie remained there alone, with the thought that this was the 2nd time that week she had told that man directly to his face, something no one else dared to say, and both times he had walked away without arguing, and she couldn't tell whether that made her safe or exactly the opposite. A few days later, Sadie was assigned to clean the entire library again, including the desk, which no one had previously allowed her to touch. She wiped the surface, cleaned the legs, then pulled out the top drawer to wipe along its inner edge, and she did it from habit rather than curiosity, because in her line of work, drawers were the places people most often forgot and the places they most often inspected. The drawer was nearly empty. There was a pen, a ring of old keys that no longer opened any lock, and in the farthest corner, lying face down, a yellowed plastic badge, the kind of employee badge with a clothing clip that hotels still issued to their workers. Sadie picked it up and turned it over. It showed a photograph of a woman, taken with a cheap camera beneath fluorescent lights, her hair gathered neatly at the nape of her neck, a collared uniform covering her shoulders, and the woman was trying to smile in the way people smiled when someone told them to smile. Beneath the photograph were the name of the hotel, the housekeeping department, and a name. Rosaria Marchetti. Sadie stood perfectly still. She had spent enough weeks cleaning this house to know that there wasn't a single human face anywhere inside it. Not one photograph, not one object suggesting that its owner had ever had anyone in his life. And now, in the palm of her hand, was the only human thing in the entire building, and it wasn't a portrait hanging on a wall or a silver-plated picture frame. It was an employee badge. She realized she was holding it in both hands, exactly as someone might hold something fragile, and she didn't hear the door open behind her. Elias was standing there. Sadie placed the badge on the desk and began to say that she was sorry, that she had been cleaning the drawer and hadn't meant to. But he raised one hand, and she fell silent. He stepped closer, looked down at the badge, and didn't pick it up. He only looked at it. Then he said that she had worked in housekeeping. Sadie didn't answer. He continued, saying that during her final years, she had worked the night shift because it paid a little extra, and she used to say that the guests slept at night, so she didn't have to listen to anyone shouting at her. He said she had died just after one of those night shifts. She had come home, set down her bag, sat on the edge of the bed, and that was all. There had been no hospital, and no one had been given enough time to call anyone. The doctor had written the name of a disease on the paper, but that name wasn't right. The truth was that she had been used up. People used up a human being the same way they used up a pair of shoes, a little more each day, until one morning they could no longer carry anyone forward, and no one ever called it an accident. Sadie remained silent. She had learned very early that when someone began speaking about something they had never spoken of before, the best thing she could do was stand still and not interrupt. Elias said that at first, his mother had been buried in the section reserved for those who had no one to pay for them. That section had no trees and no shade, and in summer, all the grass burned away. He said that several seasons later, when he finally had money, the first thing he did wasn't buy a house. He moved her somewhere else. A proper grave with a headstone and a tree large enough to cast the entire stone into shade by noon. He said he had paid to have that tree planted before he had even paid for the headstone. Then he fell silent for a very long time. Sadie asked softly whether he visited her often. Elias didn't turn to look at her. He said he had never gone there. He paid someone to cut the grass, paid someone to replace the flowers on certain occasions throughout the year, knew exactly which path led to the grave and which row it was in, and could direct Sadie to the exact place without a map. But he had never once stood before it. Not once. He closed the drawer, and the badge remained outside on the desk between them. He didn't pick it up or put it away. He told her to finish cleaning, then walked out of the room. He asked the staffing agency to send him her complete personnel file, and they delivered it that same afternoon, far thicker than he had expected. He read it from the last page backward. At first, he was only searching for the name Jonah Kowalczyk in the section listing family members, and he found it. But then he couldn't stop. There was a chain of shift change requests, one following another, stretching across nearly an entire year. She had asked to transfer from the central office route to the private residence route, even though the latter paid less. She had asked to leave a night shift in a high-rise that included extra pay and move to a day shift that offered none. She had changed districts twice, each time moving farther from her lodging, each time adding another bus to her journey. There were 3 handwritten applications asking to be considered for the Coral Gables service list. 2 had been denied, and the 3rd had been approved. On that 3rd application, in the box asking for the reason behind her request, she had written a single sentence. She wanted to work in this neighborhood. No other reason. Elias read the entire chain again, this time in chronological order. And when he finished, something stirred inside him that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in many seasons. He summoned her. He placed the open file in the middle of the desk and asked how long it had taken her to get inside this house. Sadie looked down at the papers. She didn't ask him to repeat the question, didn't pretend not to understand, and didn't try to delay for even a second. She said, "Nearly a year, sir." Elias rose to his feet, and for the first time since she had entered the house, his voice was no longer quiet. He said she had lowered her own wages, taken 2 additional buses every day, written 3 applications, and done all of it merely so she could kneel in his courtyard. What had she come there to do? What had she brought into his house? Sadie answered that she hadn't brought anything. She had no recording device, hadn't taken a single one of his papers, and had never opened any drawer except the one he had seen her open. He could have her belongings searched. He could have her body searched as well. He asked what it had all been for, then, and she told him. She said her husband had died in a warehouse in Hialeah. She had gone everywhere asking questions. She had asked the company that employed him, and they told her he wasn't their worker. She had asked the company whose name appeared on the construction project, and they directed her to another company. For 3 summers, she had gone from one desk to another, and every desk had sent her to yet another one, until she understood that no one was hiding anything from her. They had simply arranged everything so there was no one who had to answer. Then one day, she had read the name printed above all those desks, and she had wanted to see the man who carried that name with her own eyes, just once. She hadn't intended to do anything to him. She had only wanted to know whether he was a real person. Elias asked about the courtyard. Sadie was silent for a moment, then spoke very slowly. She said that morning she had heard his car at the far end of the drive. She had heard it clearly. She could have stood up. Mrs. Birdie had told her to stand, and she had heard her. But she had remained on her knees for another half-minute. She raised her eyes to his and said she had stayed on her knees for those 30 seconds to see whether that man would step past her. She had been certain he would. She had spent nearly a year preparing herself for him to step past her. She had constructed the image in her mind, a pair of expensive shoes walking around a puddle of coffee, and she had intended to carry that image home and make it her own, because at least it would have given her something certain to hate. Elias couldn't speak. Sadie continued, saying she had spent an entire year preparing to hate him, sir, and she had failed. That was the worst part. If he had stepped past her that day, everything would have been so much easier. She placed both hands on the desk and said she was resigning. She could finish the week, or she could leave that very day. It was his decision. She couldn't remain in a house where she was unable to hate its owner yet couldn't stop thinking about that warehouse. There wasn't enough room inside her to contain both things. Elias looked at her for a long time. Then he said one word. No. She asked what he had said. He said he wouldn't allow her to resign. She would remain in the house, do her work, and let him uncover the truth about that warehouse. She had spent 3 summers searching for an answer, and no one had been willing to answer her. Now she was standing directly before the man who should have answered from the beginning. She would remain there until he had finished answering her. She stayed, and she took another shift, then another. 3 shifts in succession without rest. Because the court hearing at the end of summer wouldn't ask how tired she had been. It would only ask how much she had earned. On the 3rd night, she collapsed at the foot of the kitchen stairs, and Elias reached her before even Mrs. Birdie did. He carried her upstairs in his own arms, passing through the hallway before 2 servants who stood frozen in place, laid her on the bed in the east guest room, then ordered everyone out and closed the door. He didn't turn on the light. He drew a chair beside the bed and sat in the darkness, and when she asked why he was sitting there, he said that he had been thinking ever since the day she asked whether he often visited his mother's grave, and he knew that if he didn't say it tonight, he would never say it at all. He said his mother had worked in housekeeping at a hotel owned by this family. That very hotel. His father was Vittorio Marchetti, and Vittorio had a wife and legitimate children on the other side of the city, while Elias had grown up in a rented room behind a laundry with the space for his father's name left blank on his birth certificate. His mother had never spoken one unkind word about Vittorio. That was the one thing Elias hadn't been able to forgive her for, even now. He said that when she began to grow weak, she continued going to work, because missing 1 shift meant losing 1 shift's wages. Then the time came when she could no longer make it there. And one afternoon, Elias had stood in that little kitchen and watched his mother pick up the telephone and call the Marchetti house. She hadn't called in all those years. She had never asked Vittorio for a single penny. The one time she called was the one time she had nowhere else to turn. A woman had answered. Elias had been standing 3 steps away, so he had heard everything. The woman listened to his mother give her name, and she didn't shout, didn't become angry, and didn't say a single cruel word. She merely said that no one there had that name. Then she hung up. His mother had remained there for a long while, still holding the receiver. Then she had put it down, turned to him, and smiled. She smiled. Did Sadie understand? Elias was silent for a while, then continued. His mother died not long afterward. The last thing she told him was never to let anyone see that he was soft, because softness was the first thing people took from you. That was the entire inheritance she left him. 1 sentence. And he had obeyed her more completely than any child had ever obeyed his mother. He said he hadn't risen because he was greedy for money. He had never cared about money, and Sadie only had to look around the house to know that, because there was nothing there. He had risen so that one day he could sit at the very table belonging to the house that had hung up on his mother. And he had taken that seat. He had taken the hotel. He had taken the port. He had taken everything. And did she know what happened? He sat in that chair and looked down, and beneath him he saw women exactly like his mother, pushing supply carts through hotel corridors at 2 o'clock in the morning, while he signed checks to the companies that drained the life from them, month after month, season after season. He had become the very machine that had used up his mother. Not something like it. The machine itself. He had bought it and kept it running. In the darkness, Sadie quietly asked whether he had ever ordered anyone to falsify an inspection report. He said no. And that, he said, was the part from which he couldn't escape. If he had given the order, then at least he would have been a cruel man who was present in the room. But he had never been present at all. He signed papers, received reports, watched the numbers improve with every quarter, and never once asked why they were improving. He had arranged his entire life so he would never have to ask that question. Her husband hadn't died because Elias had told someone to do something. Her husband had died because through all those years, Elias had never asked. The silence lasted a very long time. Then Sadie said that she could see the little boy standing 3 steps from the telephone. She could see him clearly. He hadn't deserved to stand there, and his mother hadn't deserved to smile after the call ended, and none of it had been his fault. Then she said that the nearly 40 names Mr. Pratt carried in his memory were his fault. Both things were true, sir, and neither truth erased the other. He had to carry them both at the same time, and he had to carry them for the rest of his life. She carried both every day, and she knew how heavy they were. But people could carry them. 3 days later, Gideon Pratt knocked on the office door early in the morning, before anyone else in the house was awake, and placed an envelope on the desk. Its edges had yellowed. It bore a real stamp and a genuine postmark, and on the front, in the careful handwriting of someone unaccustomed to writing letters, were Elias Marchetti's full name and the address of the corporate headquarters. The envelope had been neatly slit open along the top edge. Elias looked at the postmark, then sat down. He knew that date. He had read it so many times in the Hialeah file that it was fixed inside his mind, and the postmark was dated less than 2 weeks before the floor collapsed. He took out the letter. The writer began by apologizing for the disturbance, saying that he knew Elias was very busy and probably couldn't read every letter like this, but he no longer knew whom else to contact. He wrote that he worked loading and unloading cargo on the second floor of a warehouse on the west side of Hialeah, and that the floor there had been cracked for several weeks. The crack ran along a joint and grew a little wider every day, and whenever a forklift passed over it, the entire section of floor trembled. He wrote that he had reported it 3 times. The first time, he had told the foreman. The second time, he had written it in the shift log. The third time, he had spoken to someone from the cleaning and cargo handling company. No one had responded on any of those occasions. Then came a paragraph Elias had to read twice. The man wrote that he didn't want to sue anyone, sir. He didn't want anyone to lose a job because of him, not even the foreman, because that man was only following orders from above, just as he was. He only wanted someone to repair the floor. He had a wife and a little girl, and all he wanted was to go home to them when his shift ended. At the bottom of the letter, he signed his full name and included his home telephone number in case Elias needed to ask anything further. Elias set the paper down. He sat without moving for a very long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. He asked where the letter had come from. Gideon said it had been in his private safe, sir. It had remained there since that season. Elias asked why it had never reached him. Gideon said it was because he screened the mail. Elias had assigned him that duty from the beginning and instructed him not to bring anything unnecessary to his desk. Over the years, Gideon had discarded hundreds of complaints, pleas, and legal claims. Elias asked why he hadn't discarded this one. Gideon was silent. Then he told Elias not to think well of him, sir. He hadn't kept it because he felt sorry for the man who wrote it. He had kept it because he knew a day would come when someone asked who had known and done nothing. And when that day arrived, if the family needed someone to blame, Gideon would be the most convenient person in the house. The envelope bore Elias's name clearly on the front. Gideon had kept it so he could hold it to Elias's throat. He said he wasn't bringing it forward today because he had become a better man, sir. He was bringing it because the federal investigators had begun asking questions at the port, and he had run out of places to hide. Elias didn't answer. He pulled the Hialeah file toward him, opened it to the personnel section, and traced the man's name through every page. He found the formal employment contract, signed the previous spring. Then he found a second document. It was an amended agreement reclassifying the worker from a regular employee to an independent contractor hired for individual jobs, which meant that all responsibility for insurance, compensation, and workplace accidents had been removed from the corporation and placed upon the man himself. Elias looked at the date of the signature. Then he looked again at the postmark on the envelope. He counted. 8 days. The amended agreement had been signed 8 days after the letter arrived. At the bottom of the document, beneath the approval field, was Gideon Pratt's signature. Elias placed the 2 papers beside each other and pushed them toward him without saying a word. Gideon looked down. He didn't deny it. He didn't appear surprised either. He only said that after reading the letter, he had immediately understood that the floor would collapse, sir. He didn't know whether it would happen in 2 weeks or 6 months, but he knew it would happen, and the first thing he thought about wasn't the floor. Elias asked what he had thought about. Gideon said he had thought about how much they would have to pay. So he had done what he always did. He had cleaned everything up in advance. At the end of that week, the distant aunt in Homestead called Sadie, and the woman's voice was trembling so badly that Sadie had to ask her twice to slow down. She said the hospital had just called. They had scheduled Ruthie's surgery, and they had scheduled it early. And when she asked about the money, someone in the finance office told her that the entire cost had already been covered and there was nothing left to worry about. Sadie stood in the kitchen hallway with the telephone pressed to her ear, unable to say a word. Then she hung up, removed her apron, walked directly to the office, and opened the door without knocking. She placed one hand on the edge of the desk and asked what he had done. Elias said he wasn't buying her daughter, if that was what she thought. Sadie said that was exactly what she thought. She had told him she could no longer hate him, and now he had paid for her daughter's surgery, and he knew perfectly well that after this, there would be nothing more she could say. He had bought her silence with her child's heart. Elias pushed a set of papers toward her. He told her to read them. Sadie read, and she read slowly, because the language on those pages wasn't written for someone like her. It was an amendment to an employment record, signed by Elias Marchetti, restoring Jonah Kowalczyk's status as a regular employee, effective retroactively from the season in which he died, and voiding every previous document that had reclassified him as an independent contractor. Elias said he hadn't paid with his own money. He hadn't given the hospital a single dollar. What he had done was correct a document that had been made false. Her husband had been a regular employee, and he had died while working, so the corporation's employee benefits fund was obligated to provide for his wife and child, and that obligation had begun in the season of his death, not today. Her daughter's surgery wasn't a favor from him. It was the portion that had been taken from her family. Gideon had been standing in the corner of the room from the beginning, and only then did he speak. He asked whether Elias understood what he had just signed, sir. Elias had personally confirmed that the corporation had deliberately reclassified a worker after receiving a warning about a dangerous condition. He had written out the evidence of the very act the federal investigators were searching for. He had handed the prosecutor a knife and offered them the handle first. Elias said he knew. Gideon asked what he was supposed to do now. Elias told him to submit it. Submit everything, complete and without a single page missing. Then he added that Mr. Pratt should prepare himself, because his signature was also in that file. Gideon stood still for a moment, then gave a very slight nod and left. On the day of the surgery, Sadie sat in the waiting room all morning. When they finally allowed her inside, Ruthie was asleep, her hair damp against her forehead, and around her wrist was a thin plastic band bearing her name, age, and identification number. Sadie lifted the small hand to turn the band so it wouldn't press against her skin, and she saw the small line printed on the inside, the line identifying the party responsible for the cost. It didn't bear the name of the hospital, the insurance company, or Marchetti. It read J. Kowalczyk. Sadie sat down on the edge of the chair, and she didn't weep aloud because her daughter was sleeping, but she remained there for a very long time with the child's hand held inside her own. Elias arrived late that afternoon, and he didn't enter the room. He stood in the hallway several steps from the door, at precisely the distance of a man who believed he had no right to cross the threshold. Sadie came out to meet him. She said Ruthie's father had paid for her surgery. Elias said yes. It had come several seasons too late, but he had paid for it. Then Sadie said there was something she had to tell him, and after she told him, she would never mention it again. She said that several seasons earlier, after the funeral, she had gone to his corporate headquarters. She had worn the finest clothes she owned. She had told the receptionist that she wanted to see Mr. Marchetti, and the woman had asked her to wait. Sadie had sat on the bench beside the glass doors from morning until afternoon. She hadn't dared go to the restroom because she was afraid of losing her place. Near nightfall, the receptionist had told her to go home. Elias said nothing. Sadie continued, saying that in the middle of that afternoon, a man dressed in white had walked past where she was sitting. He had stopped. He had looked at her for 1 second, then returned to the reception desk, taken a bottle of water, placed it in her hand, and continued on his way. He hadn't asked whom she was waiting for. She raised her eyes to Elias and said that was how she had lived her entire life, sir. People were always giving her something small so they wouldn't have to ask what she needed. Once the file had been submitted, the federal investigators began sending requests to the subcontractors, and Curtis Brandt received his on a Thursday morning. He read the list of documents they demanded, and immediately understood that they were no longer searching blindly. They already knew what to ask for. He summoned the accountant and ordered him to retrieve every old personnel record connected with the Hialeah warehouse. He went through the pages one by one and stopped at a name in the internal debt ledger, the book Meridian used to record what workers still owed the company. Charges for uniforms, tools, advances, small amounts that accumulated until people could no longer leave. Sadie Kowalczyk. He looked at the family name and remembered. He remembered the night after the collapse, when he had sat inside the small office at the corner of the warehouse with the paper shredder running without pause. And he remembered hearing a cleaning cart in the hallway. He even remembered being annoyed that someone was still working at that hour. He called the former manager and asked who had been on duty that night. It took the man a while, but he eventually answered. Brandt hung up and remained seated for a long time. The woman who owed his company money, the woman whose husband had died on that floor, was the same woman who had stood less than 2 steps from his office door on the night he fed the original file through the shredder. He sent people to find her that same afternoon, and they returned with the news that she was no longer assigned to her former route. Her file had been transferred to private residences, and the client's name was restricted. Brandt understood what that meant. It meant she was inside a house whose gates his money couldn't open. Camille Ashford called him 3 days later. She didn't come to see him or arrange a meeting. It was only a brief call from a number no one could reach afterward. She said she had heard he was looking for someone. Brandt asked who she was. She said that wasn't important, and he didn't need to know. The person he was seeking was at the Marchetti mansion in Coral Gables, assigned to the private residence route and working the day shift, and she entered and left through the west side door because the main entrance wasn't for servants. Brandt asked what she wanted. Camille said she wanted nothing. She had merely given him an address, and an address wasn't a secret. Anyone who wished to look could find it. What he did with it was his concern, and from that moment forward, she didn't know who he was. Then she hung up, and she kept her word. She never called again, and for the remainder of this story, she wouldn't give him another piece of information. She opened only one door, the first one, and told herself that meant she hadn't done anything at all. What she didn't know was that on the other side of the city, Rocco Vitale had noticed the call. He couldn't hear what had been said. He only saw an unfamiliar number call Meridian's line during the very week the federal investigators began tightening their grip, and he wrote it down. He wrote down everything in those days. He recorded that Mr. Pratt had carried a file out of the house one morning. He recorded that the master had signed a document without sending it through the legal department. He recorded that a cleaner in the mansion was permitted to eat at the same hour as the family. He didn't report any of it to Ambrose. He didn't tell anyone at all. He merely sat in his car, smoked his cigarette to the end, and thought that the chair would eventually become vacant, and the person who occupied it would be the one who knew how to wait for the right moment. The engagement party went ahead on the appointed day, because Ambrose wanted it that way, and because the entire city had already received invitations. There were 200 guests, lights strung across the back lawn, and Sadie had been assigned to the beverage station. An arrangement she understood had come from Camille, though she made no attempt to avoid it. Halfway through the evening, Delphine Ashford stood with a group of women near the steps, telling stories about her younger days in the manner of people who liked reminding others that they, too, had once been required to work. She said that she had been a receptionist back then, for only one summer, for the Marchetti family itself, sitting behind the old reception desk on Flagler Street, answering telephone calls and taking messages. She laughed and said that calling at work made it sound more impressive than it had been, because all she had really done each day was tell people that the master wasn't there. Elias stood a few steps away with a glass of wine he hadn't touched. He turned around. He asked which summer she had worked there. Delphine gave him a vague year, the way people referred to some distant summer, and added that the heat had been unbearable, and the air conditioner in the lobby had been broken nearly the entire time. Elias didn't move. He stood there knowing precisely which summer she meant, because there had been only one summer in his life, and everything else had been divided into what came before it and what came after. He asked her one more question, and he asked it quite casually. Had she ever received a call from a woman named Rosaria? Delphine frowned. She truly thought about it, genuinely tried to remember, and that was the cruelest part. Then she laughed and said, "Good heavens, what a strange question. There had been dozens of calls like that every day, all from women demanding payment or asking to see someone. How could she possibly remember one name?" She took a sip of wine and turned back to continue her unfinished story with the other women. Elias remained where he was for several seconds. No anger rose inside him, and he recognized its absence, and that was what left him shaken. For more than 20 years, he had lived with the image of some cruel woman hanging up on his mother, and now that woman stood 3 steps away from him, holding a glass of wine and telling a story about a broken air conditioner, and she didn't remember. For his mother, that call had been the last time she ever asked anyone for anything. For this woman, it had been one of thousands of calls during a sweltering summer, one name dismissed and forgotten within the same afternoon, forgotten before her shift had even ended. Elias set his wineglass on the table and walked onto the platform. He tapped the microphone once, and the entire lawn fell silent, because that was the kind of silence the name Marchetti created. He thanked everyone for coming. Then he said that the engagement being celebrated that evening no longer existed. There would be no wedding date, and no connection of any kind between his family and the Ashford family. He didn't explain why. He didn't look at Camille or Delphine, and he didn't offer a single apology. Harlan Ashford sprang to his feet at the front table and asked whether Elias understood what he was doing to himself. Elias said he understood better than Harlan imagined. Then he made a second announcement, and this was the one that truly left the entire lawn frozen. Beginning the following morning, the complete list of subcontractors that had worked and were still working on projects bearing the corporation's name would be turned over to an independent auditing firm, one that belonged neither to his family nor to anyone in that garden, and it would have the authority to examine every page from the first to the last. At the far end of the garden, glasses struck against one another. Ambrose Marchetti remained seated with one hand resting on the table, and he didn't look at his nephew even once. Rocco Vitale stood leaning against a nearby tree, and he said nothing either, but he gave the slightest nod, like a man who had just received the gift he had been waiting for all season. Then Elias did something none of those 200 people had anticipated. He carried the microphone down from the platform, walked directly to the beverage station, and offered it to the woman standing behind the counter with a tray in her hands. Sadie didn't take it. He told her to take it. She said she couldn't speak, sir. Elias said she didn't have to say anything. She only had to read one name aloud. For 3 summers, she had gone from one desk to another, and there hadn't been a single room in the city willing to hear that name. Tonight, there was a room. He told her to read it. Read it aloud. Sadie took the microphone. Her hand trembled, and the sound of that trembling carried across the entire lawn before she could speak. Then she said it, pronouncing every syllable with perfect clarity. Jonah Kowalczyk. No one applauded. No one dared breathe. And within that silence, for the first time since that terrible summer, the name was heard by a room filled with people. On Monday morning, the attorney called and said that the grand jury would adjourn at the end of the afternoon, and if Gideon Pratt's testimony wasn't on the table before then, everything would have to wait until the next session, which was still several months away. She said their file proved a single case, and a single case could always be called a mistake. What they needed was someone to sit down and say that this wasn't a mistake. This was how things had always been done, time after time, nearly 40 times. Only one person could do that. Micah Wren drove. Gideon sat in the back seat with the file on his lap, and Sadie sat beside him. They had been traveling for about 10 minutes when Micah said, without turning around, that a vehicle was following them. No one asked him to repeat it. Sadie looked into the rearview mirror and saw only a small rectangle of glass filled with sunlight, and inside it were dark shapes moving in rhythm with them, neither drawing closer nor falling behind. Micah told Mr. Pratt to remain still and hold tightly to the file. Then the telephone in the car rang. Micah looked at the screen for 1 second, activated the speaker, and Curtis Brandt's voice filled the car, calm and almost intimate, the voice of a man who had spent his entire life selling things. He asked whether Miss Kowalczyk was in the car. No one answered. He said he knew she was. Then he said he had just sent the driver a short video and wanted him to play it for her. Micah didn't move. Brandt told him to play it. There was nothing wrong with it. Sadie told Micah to play the video. It had been recorded from a great distance, through a low fence, and the image trembled slightly as though the person filming it were holding the telephone in one hand. In the backyard, a little girl was chasing a red plastic ball. She caught up with it, missed when she tried to kick it, fell onto the grass, then burst out laughing, the way children laughed when they found themselves amusing. The distant aunt stood on the porch and called her inside to eat, and the girl raised one hand, said something, then began running again. The video lasted less than half a minute. Then it ended. Brandt asked whether Sadie had watched carefully. He said he wanted to make himself clear, and she shouldn't misunderstand him. No one had touched the child. No one would touch her. He wasn't that kind of man, and Sadie was intelligent enough to know that he wasn't foolish enough to do anything like that. He only wanted her to know one thing. He knew where the girl was. He knew that yard, knew that fence, and knew what time they called her inside to eat. He told Sadie to instruct the driver to turn the car around, for all 3 of them to return home, and then everything he had just said would cease to mean anything at all. No one in the car spoke. Gideon gripped the file so tightly that his fingertips turned white. Micah looked at Sadie through the mirror. Sadie was staring down at the darkened telephone screen where, only seconds earlier, her daughter had fallen onto the grass and laughed. She stared for a very long time. She remained silent so long that Brant had to ask whether she was still listening. Then Sadie raised her head. She said that she had heard him, Mr. Brant. His voice was very calm, and she believed he had planned this telephone call very carefully, but she thought he had just ruined it. Brant asked what she meant. Sadie said he had just shown her daughter laughing in order to make her remain silent. Did he understand what he had done? For the past 3 summers, she had gone from one place to another asking about her husband, and there had been days when she sat on the bus and could no longer remember why she was doing any of it. She had become so tired that she had forgotten the reason. She said that he had just shown her the reason. He had placed directly before her eyes the exact thing she was fighting for, and he had shown it more clearly than anyone ever had. She had seen her daughter run. She had seen her run, Mr. Brant. Only a few weeks earlier, the child had still needed to sit and rest on the 4th stair, and the man who had paid for her to run was her father, a man whose name Brant's company had erased so it wouldn't have to pay a single dollar. She said that if she turned the car around now, then 20 years from now, that little girl would be grown and would know that her mother had traded her father's name for one peaceful afternoon. Sadie would rather see her grow up poor. Then she reached forward and ended the call. The car fell completely silent. Sadie placed the telephone face down on her lap, her hands still bandaged across the knuckles and clasped together, and she said very softly, "Micah, keep going." They drove a little farther before another call came through on Micah's telephone, and this time he didn't activate the speaker. He raised the telephone to his ear, listened without saying anything, and Sadie saw in the rearview mirror that his jaw had tightened. He listened for only a few seconds. Then he turned on the signal and pulled over to the side of the road. No one inside the car breathed. Gideon sat rigid in the back seat, holding the file against his chest the way someone might hold a child. Sadie looked outside at the strip of sun, scorched grass running along the roadside, and she thought, very quickly and very clearly, that this was how it happened. That she had been sitting in someone else's car believing she was escaping, when in truth, they had only been driving her to the exact place they wanted her. She thought of the little girl on the grass. She said nothing. Micah switched off the engine. He turned around, looked directly at her, and said there was something he had to tell her. Miss Kowalczyk. For the past several years, he had driven for Mr. Marchetti, and throughout those years, he had reported everything the man did, where he went, whom he met, how long they spoke, and what time he returned home. Someone had placed Micah there from the beginning, before he had ever held the keys to that car. He had never belonged to Mr. Marchetti. Sadie didn't answer. Gideon released a very quiet breath from the back seat. Micah continued. The call he had just received instructed him to stop the car. It didn't ask why, offer an explanation, or need to explain anything, because in all those years, Micah had never questioned an order even once. Then he looked down at the telephone in his hand. He switched it off, lowered the window, and threw it onto the strip of sun-scorched grass, and no one heard it land because the traffic passing them was too loud. He said he had just quit his job. He reached into the compartment in the car door, took out a set of keys, and handed them to Sadie. He said that about 200 paces ahead, there was a parking lot behind a gas station. An old gray car with a faded license plate was waiting there. He had left it there the previous night. She was to take the keys, walk along the grassy shoulder with Mr. Pratt, and neither run nor look back. Sadie asked what would happen to him. Micah said he would keep driving. The vehicles behind them didn't know her face, and they didn't know Mr. Pratt's face. They only knew this car. All morning, they had been following the car, not the people inside it. So Micah would drive it far away in another direction, and they would follow, because that was the only task they had been given. Gideon asked whether he understood what would happen to him. Micah said he did. Then he added that Mr. Pratt had spent the entire journey holding those papers as though he were holding his own life. When he got inside, he had better testify properly. Micah didn't want to drive all those miles for a man who would change his mind at the final moment. Sadie took the keys. She said she didn't know what to say to him. Micah told her not to say anything. She needed to go. It was time. Then he turned forward and started the engine, waiting until they had stepped out, closed the doors, and begun walking along the grassy shoulder before pulling onto the road again. He continued for a long distance, turned away from the main road, and drove through several old industrial districts until they blocked him at a dead end near the port. He didn't try to escape any farther. He switched off the engine, placed both hands on the steering wheel, and sat there staring straight ahead. They yanked open the car door and demanded to know where the woman was. He didn't answer. They asked where the old man was, where the file was, and who had told him to do this. He still didn't answer. They questioned him again and again for a very long time, and throughout it all, Micah Wren didn't speak a single word. Not one word, and the only thing he thought about was the laughter of a little girl chasing a red ball in a video recorded from very far away. The testimony was submitted before closing time, and word reached the family before nightfall. They convened in the back room of a restaurant in Little Havana, a windowless room with a long table covered in white cloth, where every important matter had been decided without a written record since Vittorio's time. 7 men took their seats. Ambrose occupied the head of the table according to custom. Elias sat at his right, and Rocco Vitali sat 2 places away wearing the expression of a man attending a ceremony for which he had prepared his clothes long ago. Rocco spoke first. He said that the man occupying this chair had turned over the family's entire subcontractor file to an outside auditing firm. He said the man occupying this chair had signed a document that the legal department itself hadn't been allowed to review, and that document was now on the prosecutor's desk. He said he wasn't discussing what was right or wrong, sirs. He was asking only one question. If the man occupying this chair couldn't protect the house, then what purpose did he serve by keeping the chair? Murmurs traveled along the table. A man at the far end asked what Elias had been thinking, and another said that this would affect families that had nothing to do with the matter. Elias allowed them to finish, as he always allowed everyone to finish. Then he took a yellowed sheet of paper from inside his coat, placed it on the white tablecloth, and pushed it toward the head of the table. He asked Uncle Ambrose to read it aloud before they voted. Ambrose looked at the paper. He didn't ask what it was. He put on his glasses, picked it up, and began to read. He read slowly, his voice steady, placing no emphasis anywhere, beginning with the apology for causing a disturbance, continuing through the description of the crack running along the joint, through the 3 warnings that no one had answered, through the paragraph in which the writer said that he didn't want to sue anyone and didn't want anyone to lose a job because of him, and ending with the final sentence, that all he wanted was to go home to his wife and daughter when his shift was over. Then Ambrose read the name signed beneath it. He folded the letter and placed it on the table. No one in the room spoke. Rocco looked down at his hands. Ambrose removed his glasses and said that they would now vote. The first man voted against Elias. The second man voted against him. Rocco voted against him, saying the words slightly louder than necessary. Then it was Ambrose's turn. He sat in silence for a while before saying that he, too, voted against Elias. Elias showed no reaction. He rose, took the keys to the port office from his pocket, and placed them in the middle of the table beside the yellowed letter. Then he turned to Rocco. He told Rocco to take the chair. He had waited for it long enough. Elias said he would leave him with only one warning, and Rocco could laugh if he wished. One day, inside Rocco's own house, a woman would have to kneel and clean the floor before his guests. He wouldn't find that day written on any calendar. It would simply arrive, and when it did, Rocco would have to choose. Elias could only hope that by then, something remained inside him with which to make that choice. Then Elias walked out with his back straight, and not one of the 7 men at the table watched him leave. Ambrose was waiting in the narrow hallway, leading to the rear door. He took hold of his nephew's elbow and asked very quietly whether Elias understood what he had just done for him. Elias didn't answer. Ambrose said that if he had voted in Elias's favor, then the following morning Elias would still belong to that table, and when the prosecutor knocked on the door, everything attached to the table would also be attached to him. Ambrose had taken away his chair so that when they came, there would be nothing left for them to take from him. Elias would enter with empty hands, and empty hands could be cuffed, but nothing could be stolen from them. Then he added that he had sat at that table since the days of Elias's father, and this was the first time he had ever done one thing right. He had done it far too late. He released Elias's arm and returned inside. In the parking lot behind the restaurant, Camille waited beside her car with the keys in her hand, showing no sign of haste. She didn't threaten him or plead for anything. She only asked whether he knew why she hated that woman Elias. It wasn't because he had chosen her. Camille said her mother had taught her before she could even read that she must never allow anyone to see her wanting something, because the thing a person wanted was the handle by which others could carry them away. She had learned very well. She had taught herself not to want anything in this world, and it had taken her entire youth to accomplish it. She opened the car door and said that then Elias had given that very thing freely to a woman who cleaned floors, in broad daylight, before the entire city. He had given away the thing Camille had been forced to kill inside herself in order to survive. Then she entered the car and drove away without looking back once. The case stretched across several seasons, and when it ended, Elias Marchetti accepted a sentence under a plea agreement. He paid fines, lost the right to manage any legal entity bearing the family name, received probation and community service, and throughout the entire process, he never once asked for leniency. His attorney told him that if he would simply agree to testify that he had known nothing about those documents, his sentence would be substantially reduced. And Elias answered that he had known, and that was precisely the problem. Curtis Brandt was prosecuted. Ronald Pike lost his license and stood trial beside him. Gideon Pratt testified from beginning to end, concealing nothing, including the part bearing his own signature. And he also received a sentence. After the trial, he told his attorney that it was the first night in all those years when he had slept without waking until morning. The compensation fund was established with part of the seized assets, and everything Elias had left after all his obligations had been paid. He didn't give it his family's name. He called it the Jonah Kowalczyk Fund. On the day of the announcement, they gathered in a small hall with plastic chairs and ceiling fans. No reporters were invited. And the person who stood to read the names of the families receiving compensation was Bernadette Mullaney. She read each name slowly, pausing after every one long enough for someone in the room to raise a hand. There were names for which no hand was raised because the entire family had moved away long ago or because no one remained. And in those moments, she still waited exactly the same length of time before continuing. She read nearly 40 names that way. And she needed to look at the paper only once because Gideon had sat with her throughout the previous evening, reading every name aloud. Family court restored Sadie's custody of Ruthie at the end of that summer. She rented a 2-room apartment on the south side of the city, on the ground floor, with a small patch of yard behind it, just large enough for a plastic ball to roll from one end to the other. Elias offered to help exactly once, and she said no. She told him that she knew he was offering because he wanted to give, not because he wanted to buy anything. And that was precisely why she had to refuse. If she accepted, then everything she had ever said to him would become nothing more than the words of someone waiting to be given something. She accepted money from the fund, exactly the amount that belonged to her family and not a penny more. Then she enrolled in a program to earn a workplace safety inspection certificate, attending classes at night 3 evenings a week. And during the first class, when the instructor asked why she had chosen this profession, she said it was because a man had written a letter warning about a crack, and no one had answered him. The woman came to Sadie's door one afternoon in October. Sadie opened it and stood there, and for a moment she didn't recognize her own mother, because the woman had aged far more than the number of seasons that had passed. Dolores Vance didn't step inside. She remained on the porch, opened her purse, and took out a newspaper clipping folded into quarters, the paper worn soft along its creases from being opened and folded again too many times. It was a brief article about the Hialeah warehouse collapse from that season, and she said that the moment she saw the family name, she knew it was Sadie. She said she had left that man several seasons ago and was living alone near Fort Myers. Then she spoke the words she had come there to say. She said she had never disbelieved her. Sadie. That afternoon when Sadie brought home the notebook, her mother had believed her from the very first page. She had merely begun calculating, and she had calculated that their family couldn't afford to believe her. That was the calculation she had made, and she had been wrong. She had been wrong by an entire lifetime, child. And she hadn't come to ask for forgiveness, because she knew forgiveness wasn't something a person could ask to receive. Sadie stood still for a very long time. She didn't embrace her mother. She didn't cry. She looked at the newspaper clipping in the woman's hand, then looked behind herself into the apartment, where a fan was turning and a red plastic ball rested beneath a chair. Then she told her mother to sit down. The woman froze. Sadie said she wasn't saying that she forgave her, not today, but she should sit down because the little girl would be waking soon. Ruthie was always very hungry after her afternoon nap, and she talked all afternoon, and she would ask her grandmother every question she could think of. Then Sadie opened the door a little wider and said that the child had never had a grandmother before. They entered the cemetery on a weekend morning, while the sunlight was still gentle, and the grass remained wet with dew. Elias didn't need to ask anyone for directions. He turned at the first path, past 2 rows of headstones, then stopped before a slab of dark granite resting entirely beneath the shade of a mature rain tree, its broad canopy spreading over the ground below. He stood about 3 steps from the headstone and went no farther. Sadie stood beside him without speaking or urging him forward. She had learned long ago that there were silences it would be cruel to fill. He remained that way for a very long time. Then he said, very softly, that he didn't know what to say to his mother. He had thought about it throughout all those years. Thought about it until he had memorized dozens of different opening sentences. Yet not one of them had survived beyond the first 3 words. He said she had given him one instruction, and he had followed it more completely than he had ever done anything else in his life. But he couldn't tell her what had come from obeying her because he didn't want her to have to hear it. He fell silent for a while, then took 1 step forward, only one, and said that perhaps he would say this instead. I am here, Mom. I am here. And I didn't come alone, and I didn't come hardened. Sadie reached out and took his hand. She didn't hold it like someone comforting another person, nor like someone expressing gratitude. She held his hand the way 2 people stood when carrying something heavy together, side by side, shoulder to shoulder, sharing the weight equally. In the distance, across the broad lawn near the entrance, a little girl was running. She chased a red plastic ball rolling into a shallow hollow, ran a long distance without stopping to rest even once, and when she caught it, she raised both hands toward the sky, then turned and called out to the 2 adults. She called Elias by his name, only his name, without any title, because that was how her mother had instructed her to address him. Sadie wouldn't allow herself to promise her daughter anything she wasn't certain of, and she wouldn't place upon the shoulders of a man who had just lost everything the burden of becoming something for a child. She allowed things to remain exactly as they were. A name called aloud in the sunlight across a field of grass. Elias heard the call and turned his head. He raised one hand and waved, and on the face of the man who had once made an entire city hold its breath was something no one had ever seen before. This story ends there, and if there is anything worth carrying away from it, perhaps it is 3 very simple truths. The first is that a person's dignity isn't determined by whether they are standing or kneeling, but by what they choose when no one remains to defend them. Some people spend their entire lives seated in lofty chairs without ever once standing straight, while others kneel in the middle of a courtyard and still preserve everything they are. The second is that silence is also a form of participation. A person doesn't have to commit an evil act to bear responsibility for it. Receiving a letter and leaving it unopened, hearing a cry and turning away, or signing a document without asking where it leads, can be enough for tragedy to befall someone. And the third is that some debts in life can never be repaid, and some names can never be called back. But even when an old debt can't be repaid, any one of us, on any given day, can still refuse to write another line in that ledger. If today's story touched you even a little, please click like and share it so more people can hear it. Please subscribe to our channel so we can listen together each day to warm and meaningful stories like this one. Most of all, we hope you will leave a comment and tell us your honest feelings about this story and the character who gave you the most to think about. Because we read every one of your comments with our deepest appreciation. We wish everyone listening abundant health and a life filled with peace, happiness, and lightness each day. Thank you for staying with us until the very final moments. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.